All right, so we're looking at a piece of art and propaganda promoting the freedom of slaves and African Americans. The passage of the 13th Amendment. A lot going on in this image. On the right, we have African American soldiers freeing slaves and marching in the distance. That kind of connects us to the 54th of Massachusetts that we learned about in the Civil War. We have a Union soldier trampling upon a Confederate flag with freedom to the slave as a banner attached to the American flag flying. On the left, a lot of deep symbolism here. Public schools at the back with African Americans entering in the distance, a church steeple, and sitting in front here, an African American man being able to read with his children at his feet and his plow at his side. This is symbolic of a man who has his freedom to work, freedom of leisure, freedom to have the ability to be literate, and freedom to have a family. So a lot going on with this particular piece of art. So the problems with peace we talked about before. How are you going to integrate the newly freed slaves into society, reintegrate, bring back in the Confederate states or Southern states? What are you going to do with your former Confederates like Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy? Who's going to be in charge of Reconstruction, Lincoln or Congress? What's it going to look like? Southern way of life was ruined, crops destroyed, farms destroyed, slaves are now freed, major cities and metropolitan areas burnt to the ground, railroads destroyed, and Southerners, a lot of them still remain defiant. This is a political cartoon from the era. It's called the Treason Toddy. It's got Benedict Arnold on the left, Jeff Davis depicted in women's clothes on the right, because when he was captured in Georgia, he had his wife's shawl over his shoulders, trying to disguise himself. So both North and South would produce cartoons sort of lampooning Jefferson Davis, hiding in women's clothing. And then obviously the devil there in the center, and below the Treason Toddy it says 1865. So the freedmen are going to have a really complex scenario set in front of them. How are they going to be brought into the United States as free people, both free men and women? A lot of the African Americans had been apprehended by the Union Army, so they were known as contraband. The Freedmen's Bureau that was established by Oliver O. Howard and Congress, he was a Union general, are going to go about establishing schools, mostly in churches, for African Americans, also centers of higher education. Keep in mind that the African Methodist Episcopal Church is going to be a center of that society. The policy of 40 acres and a mule, did I talk about that before? Where Sherman handed out all these land grants, but ultimately most of those land grants kind of were lost because the African Americans that got the grants didn't have the deeds to the land. So a lot of these gains are going to be really, they have a lot of strings attached. Here we have freed slaves in New Bern, North Carolina, and what we're looking at behind them is a place where they would have likely attended school. And this primary document, this image, tells us a really incredible story about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was educating children, adults, and the elderly all in the same classroom. And the majority of the time, that classroom was typically in churches and other community centers throughout the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was everywhere. New Bern, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina, Lexington, Virginia, all over the American South throughout the former Confederate states. So the U.S. Bureau of Refugees and Freedmen and Abandoned Land was formed, led by Oliver O. Howard, But the Bureau did more, the Freedmen's Bureau did more than just educate, provided medical care, provided food, it provided labor training. Do keep in mind the Laurel Land Grant Act that we learned about before helps create some of our earliest historically black colleges, one of which is actually named for Oliver O. Howard, Howard University. It's going to be one of the earliest and most prominent African American schools during this era and today. So here on the left we have Oliver O. Howard, and this is a depiction of what the Freedmen's Bureau would have really looked like, educating young and old. A lot of the people that volunteered to teach through the Bureau were young women from the North. A lot of them were like really devout, Quakers, devout Presbyterians, Episcopalians, different religious faiths that sort of saw this as missionary work. The early plan for Reconstruction really begins as soon as Lincoln takes that second oath of office on March 4th, 1865, where he says, "With malice toward none, charity for all, we must bind up the nation's wounds." Lincoln wants a really quick Reconstruction plan. This plan is called the 10% plan. 10% of the population that can vote will take an oath of allegiance to the Union and be willing to free slaves and rewrite their state constitutions, then they can re-enter. On the flip side, you've got a more sort of like balanced radical to moderate Republican approach, and that was the Wade Davis bill. And as I talk about both groups, the radical Republicans they wanted the South to pay. They wanted more retribution. Whereas like the moderates were a little bit more sort of like, trying to like compromise moving into Reconstruction. Not that they were wanted to be lenient on the South, but they didn't want Reconstruction to necessarily drag out. This is a monumental task to try to bring this country back together. So they agree upon a bill called the Wade Davis bill, declaring that 50% of that voting population needed to vote to re-enter. Well, Lincoln uses the pocket veto, which means he doesn't really do anything. He's waiting for it to expire. And we know that, well, it will, both the 10% plan and the Wade Davis bill all kind of fall apart because just 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated at Ford's Theater. So we have Lincoln's plan for reuniting the nation, the rail splitter at work repairing the Union. It's a cartoon of Lincoln's 10% plan squaring off with the Wade Davis bill. So, Lincoln's assassination, Lincoln is attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It's a benefit. The particular play is a British comedy, Our American Cousin. And as we know, John Wilkes Booth and his group of conspirators, he's a John Wilkes Booth actor, had served a little bit as a militiaman, never really enlisted into the army, but was a Confederate sympathizer. Decides to put this plot together. He'll assassinate Lincoln, and his followers will assassinate Secretary of State William Seward, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and General Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Grant doesn't attend the play. Seward's assassin stabs him but doesn't kill him, and Johnson's assassin doesn't follow through, but Booth most certainly does. He sneaks up to the presidential box, the balcony, the area that Lincoln is sitting in, fires a .44 caliber Derringer into the back of Lincoln's head. The bullet lodges behind his right eye. Lincoln, obviously, this is a mortal wound. The bullet goes through his brain. Booth jumps off the stage, or jumps off the balcony onto the stage, catching a boot spur onto the curtain, breaks his leg, yells "Sic Semper Tyrannis," and goes on the run. He'll be captured on April 26th near Bowling Green, Virginia, just outside of Richmond. He'll be surrounded. They'll light fire to the barn he's hiding in, and he'll be shot by Union cavalry. 1865. So we're just talking about just, Lincoln's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox, and he's Booth's captured just under 2 weeks after. Yeah, if you ever, I would recommend, if you ever go to, I recommend all of you go to Ford's Theater and visit. The national parks own it now. You guys should really think about checking out a play at Ford's Theater. It's really cool. It's not super expensive. And then they have like little maps that you can pick up there. And one of the maps shows the route that he took from, because he's trying to get as far south as he can get. Yeah, but there are a couple of things that he's up against. He's up against Alan Pinkerton and the Pinkertons detective agency, and he's also up against the fact that much of that area south of DC is now under Union occupation.
Wait, is it
actually, if you look up on the flag there, that's the Virginia State Motto.
Wasn't this not his first game plan though? Is that why he
Yeah, there have been multiple times he could have assassinated him at his inauguration. But Lincoln, you do have to understand, Lincoln had an entire desk drawer full of death threats that he held on to. All right, so that moves us on to Andrew Johnson. Johnson is going to take the oath of office. He's from very poor and humble beginnings in East Tennessee. He's a tailor from Tennessee. Served in Congress, but he's the only Southern congressman that had been a member of a former Confederate state, who didn't go with the South and stayed in the Union. So he's kind of like a Clement Vallandigham that we talked about. Kind of like, remember Clement Vallandigham? He was the copperhead who neither side trusted.
Yeah.
That's kind of like Andrew Johnson. He's kind of like a man without a country. The North doesn't trust him. The South doesn't trust him. Even though he's a states' rights guy, he's arguably one of the most racist presidents in American history. He used the veto power to pretty much block any African American rights that he could. This guy is way in over his head, though. All right? Just because he idolized Andrew Jackson and saw himself as the next Jacksonian, just because he was a barroom brawler and a dueler and a fighter and the common man, that didn't mean he was going to be able to take on a larger political force than he. And that larger political force is going to be the radical Republicans and even the moderates. He's just outnumbered. And when you think about it, this man used over 20 vetoes to block African American rights in the Reconstruction era, but Congress used the override of 2/3 votes more than it had ever used in American history, and it likely won't be replicated. I never say never, right? You never know what will happen in history. So here's Andrew Johnson. This is the tragedy and complexity of the freedmen's situation after the war, and that is black codes are passed. That's the bottom line. It's legitimate racism, right? So here's what essentially happens, and I want you all to kind of pay attention to this as we think about, as I get through it, think about what this sounds like, right? So to try to, in the process of providing freedom, the black codes are passed where African Americans are still forced to work. They can't jump their labor contracts. They can't sit idle. They must, and I want everybody to pay attention to this, they must follow through with curfews, right? Right. But what do we call those? The slave codes. So a lot of the slave codes are the black codes, right? So it's just a different name. What this whole thing does, tragically, this sets forth two very problematic institutions. Number one, Jim Crow laws. Number two, the system of sharecropping. And really what's wild is, and what's really tragic, is that those laws and that style of labor, it really doesn't get resolved until the 1960s and 70s, okay? So that's really why when we're sort of breaking all this down, we're the first generations in America to truly have equal rights. And I want you all to think about this on a daily basis. No, it's not. Right. So that's the reason why we constantly move forward with that theme, and we hit on it every day in this class. We must understand how this began and where we've come from and where we're going, so that those rights aren't ever lost again. Exactly. So on another level that I really want to sort of bring to the forefront with you, for you guys too, I want you guys to understand that this is a brutal, bitter history. And it's not one that is easily explained. And I'm not going to shy away from it. It's a theme that we've got to embrace and address. And I want everybody to remember, as you look around the class, this class, and look around the school, what we've got going on in here makes us better people, makes us a better society, makes us a better community. Because this is real, right? We are preparing for the real world. And that's something I want us to keep in mind.
I like the way you teach me.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate it. It's the truth. So, I do want to talk to you a little bit about Jim Crow. Who was Jim Crow? Jim Crow is not real. Okay? Jim Crow is a character. He is a minstrel character. He can go as far back, we can trace him as far back as the 1830s. Where he really gains popularity is actually through the Civil War. Just like today or in modern history, when people are at war, they like to be entertained. So there were minstrel shows that would go around and entertain the Union Army. It just so happens, and again, folks, pay attention here, this particular character was actually played in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and in the Civil War. This character was played by, and the other Jubilee characters were played by African Americans. It's not until after the war that this character starts to be played by a white character in blackface. And this becomes a bigger problem moving into radio and television and movies, or radio movies and television, that I'll just get into later down the road. So I'll come back to this when the time comes. I do want to explain what the premise of this character. Jim Crow is a free man. In his mind, he's free. Okay? He is no longer a slave. He is upwardly mobile socially. He's well-dressed. He's educated. He's articulate. And he is a man on the move. That's how he sees himself. But in reality, Jim Crow is not truly free. He does not have nice clothes. He is not articulate. He is not well educated. And he is not going anywhere socially. That is the metaphor for Jim Crow laws. On the outside, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, it appeared that African Americans were gaining rights. But in reality, laws that were established at local and state levels that were inspired by the black codes led to this, to oppress and keep African Americans down. Thank you. That's a good day. See you tomorrow. So this will hang with us. Okay, this will stay with us until the passage of a series of laws in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And we're going to learn by the end of this lesson and moving into the next one in the next semester how these laws are actually upheld. And then they get even worse. Like, in order to vote, you have to pay a poll tax, or in order to vote, you have to pass a literacy test, or in order to vote, you have to travel an hour and a half to be able to register, and then an hour and a half another way to be able to vote. There were all these ways in which African Americans and women and Latinos and poor whites, and there are other people that are impacted by this as well. Let's talk a little bit about congressional Reconstruction. Really, there's like really a lot of infighting on how are you going to deal with former Confederates. Are you going to arrest them? Are you going to try them for war crimes? Well, for the most part, not everybody really could agree on whether it should be reconciliation or whether it should be punitive with military tribunals. What people could agree was that there were some decent scapegoats that they could use. Like Jefferson Davis locked up in Fort Monroe was a significant scapegoat. Vice President Alexander Stephens for the Confederacy locked up in Boston was a decent scapegoat. Henry Wirz, Commandant of Andersonville, where like 13,000 people died of malnutrition, him being executed for war crimes, they could get behind that, right? So this process actually drags on for a number of different reasons. They can't really agree on anything. Furthermore, they can't really agree with Johnson either. And do keep in mind that you're talking about a lot of people that served in the Confederacy. It'd be very difficult to try to just go down and say, okay, we're trying everyone for military crimes. That wasn't logistically going to necessarily work out, and that's not something that was feasible for even the Union military, the Union Army, to try to undertake. Believe it or not, they don't go for the tribunals, but they do go for the military occupation that we're actually going to talk about a little bit later. Yeah?
Were Union soldiers ever tried for war crimes, or were they overlooked for war crimes?
The only people that were really tried or convicted were conspiracy people that were like involved in conspiracies, like a justice by the name of Milligan was a civilian. It actually led to a groundbreaking Supreme Court case I'm going to talk about later. It's called Ex Part Milligan, settled in 1866. He was a civilian justice who was believed to be conspiring with the Confederacy, so they like wanted to get to a military tribunal, and they actually ended up it became a groundbreaking case because the case protects civilians in wartime. Just some double agents, smugglers, things of that nature, spies that got locked up. Roosevelt and Malcolm survived. I mean, really, the worst thing was like the people that died in Andersonville and other Belle Isle, and the prison camps, right? They were starved to death. That was bad enough. All right. So this is an interesting cartoon that I wanted to pull. Just it sort of highlighting the racism of Johnson. So it shows the veto power. This is one of Johnson's vetoes, and it's the refunding of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, do keep in mind the Freedmen's Bureau does not make it all the way to the end of the Reconstruction, but in this particular case, his veto of refunding it is going to be overridden. So I don't know if you get the joke here, but we call a chest of drawers a bureau, and we have little images of black people flying out of it. So it's referring to him kicking the Freedmen's Bureau out of Congress. Does that make sense? So that's like the premise of the cartoon. So Johnson clashes with Congress over nearly every civil rights bill, refunding the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is really tragic because all the safeguards that were laid out in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 were completely ignored for 98 years. The 13th Amendment to ban slavery, the 14th Amendment to grant African Americans citizenship and equal rights under the protection of the law, regardless of previous condition of servitude. That's an important one. So Johnson is defeated on all of these measures that he tries to block. This creates turmoil between Johnson and Congress, but it creates a great deal of camaraderie between members of Congress. Because what you guys need to realize, many of these people had sharpened their tools during the war. They had passed legislation through the war that had expanded the government, and they didn't have any opposition. The only opposition they had was within their own party. They didn't have Democrats that were going against them. The only Democrat in Congress was Johnson, right? So, Moral Land Grant Act, Legal Tender Act, Moral Tariff Act, Homestead Act, Pacific Railroad Act. That's just 5 of like 30 laws, 30 plus laws that were passed during this era. So they had no problem, sorting it out amongst themselves. So what ultimately happens is this. All states, regardless, must pass the 13th and 14th Amendment. All former Confederate states re-entering the Union must write new state constitutions, and they must pass the 13th and 14th Amendment, ratified into their constitution. Furthermore, another amendment must be ratified as well, and that's going to be the 15th Amendment that will allow African American men the right to vote. So on the left here, we've got the Civil Rights Bill cartoon. It's got sort of like, the hand, who Columbia is? Shows the hand there. Anybody know who Columbia is? Columbia. She's Lady Liberty. That's another name for Lady Liberty. And then this fellow on the right here is John Curtis Underwood. John Curtis Underwood, he is a native of New York. He had attended Hamilton College, come down south to teach for a while, picked up a law degree, started practicing law, got a position as a justice in Fauquier County, Virginia, which is just north of Richmond. And he was a staunch abolitionist. So once the war was over, he was in a pretty good spot politically. What would we call a person who had come from the north to the south, either before, during, or after the Civil War, and took advantage of political, economic, or personal gain? A carpetbagger. Very good. This, very good. John Curtis Underwood is an example of a carpetbagger. Carpetbaggers are a complex group, meaning that there are a multitude of reasons why carpetbaggers wind up in the South. They might be coming to get rich. They might be coming to help African Americans or poor whites or devastated orphan children from the South learn to read, write, help them, get a job, feed them. You never know. There was a lot of mission work going on during this era as well. Oh, a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau teachers, and they were, a lot of them were considered themselves missionaries, But the idea of a carpetbagger, it's like that term is sort of like a blasphemous term, because that means you would take a piece of carpet, fold it together, sew up the sides, put a handle on it, and be on the go, like jam it full of money, and just take advantage. So that's sort of the premise. Now, there's a name for someone who was a former Confederate that would have gone from being, in the South, probably a Democrat, but went north or joined the Republican Party. One of the most famous, hands down, is Lee's Corps Commander James Longstreet. So vilified that when we talk about Confederate statues, he only has one in the entire South. And in a revisionist history, he would have been, well, sort of like a revisionist history of really Virginia history. For a very long time, he sort of got the blame for Gettysburg. Ironically, he was the guy trying to talk Lee out of attacking Gettysburg. It's something that you would call, it's a name that a pirate would use. Scurvy is a good guess. Scalawag.
Oh, yeah.
Scalawag. So a scalawag. So we'll talk more about scalawags moving forward. This is where I'm going to pump the brakes. So keep in mind that Johnson has to be reelected, right? He didn't get elected in the first place, but if he wants to get reelected, he's going to have to go on a sort of a campaign speaking tour. So he goes on what is called the round the circle speeches, by rail mostly, from town to town, but just like what we've witnessed in recent years, he's heckled, right? Yeah, by people in the crowd. So, boo, boo, cannot boo. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that. It's hilarious. I'll explain later. So, how does he handle the hecklers? Much like his hero would have handled hecklers, Andrew Jackson. He yells back at him. They're called the give 'em hell speeches. And certainly they're not the only two presidents that yell back with their hecklers. Think about Teddy Roosevelt. Man got shot during a speech, and took his speech out of his jacket, bloody, screaming at the guy tried to kill him, and he kept on going. Right? Certainly our current president doesn't handle hecklers all that well either. He likes to give them hell. So, anyway, this particular cartoon is a really great cartoon because it really nails down sort of the irony and the demise of Andrew Johnson, and I guess pun intended there, because he is a strict constitutional constructionist, much like the early Democrats of Jeffersonian and Jacksonian era. But what he lacks is a great deal of depth in understanding the Constitution. And certainly that has been a problem many presidents in American history have faced, past and present, right? So, that is the issue here. Johnson has a trap, constitutional trap laid, and he will step into said trap. So, with that, we'll sort of pump the brakes on this cartoon. This little boy would persist in handling books above his capacity. Volume 14 of the U.S. Constitution. And this was the disastrous result. So that is a good place for us to stop.